Because come on, even if you stay in America, we got the Jersey Devil, we got Mothman, we have so much stuff. And you said, dogs. Give me some variety, please and thank you. Hi, hello, welcome back to Babbling Books. This is my first attempt at a wrap-up video. We are not going to discuss the fact that it is absolutely going to be a train wreck, and let's just jump right in. I read 6 books this January. They were all absolutely fantastic. There are none that I regret reading, which is wonderful. I usually read a good bit in January, so I was thrilled when that continued this year. And I'm just hoping I can keep it up in February, but that's a whole nother topic of discussion. That's a whole nother topic. For now, let's just jump right in and get with the books that I read. All right. First off the bat is a very long title, so I will just read it to you because there's no way for me to remember it. I Know What I Saw: Modern Day Encounters with Monsters of New Urban Legend and Ancient Lore by Linda S. Godfrey. A mouthful. I listened to this book on audiobook. This book it's all in the name. Linda S. Godfrey went around. She interviewed people who had first-hand encounters with modern day monsters and myths. And it was a solid read. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I will say I was a little disappointed because based on that title, you would think it'd cover a lot of ground, a lot of different monsters, a lot of different myths. It didn't. It was 90% about dogmen. There was a chapter on big cats and how, like, panthers and stuff. That chapter was very interesting because it would discuss how panthers, are they really more of a cryptid? Because panthers, in the sense that people were thinking of, didn't exist and didn't live in that area. So would they count as a cryptid because people keep seeing them, but that's not what they are? That one was interesting. But again, 70% of the book was about dogmen. There was one other chapter that was about elves, and that one was weird because it was people going like, I can get high, I can get drunk. I've never hallucinated when I do either of these, but one time I did both and I met an elf. I don't know what to do with that information. And so that's the thing. Those were basically it. I can't even remember the specifics on the dogmen stories because so much of the book was on dogmen stories. A lot of the lower ranking reviews for this on Goodreads were complaining that it was just a list of encounter stories. I didn't mind that. It's in the name. It's modern day encounters. I don't know what they expected. I just expected a bigger variety of monsters and myths. And there really wasn't. So it was 3 stars. I enjoyed it. I thought the encounters were cool. I found out a lot more about like different local urban legends within America because it's very American-centric. But I definitely wish it wasn't so American-centric and it branched out on what types of monsters it discussed. The second book I read was Ghostland, A History of Haunted Places in America. Something like... This one is, again, I have short memory. We're just going to read this one to you again. Alright, the second book I read, again, very long title, so I'm just going to read it to you. Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. It was fabulous. This one I actually gave 4 out of 5 stars. Again, I read it in audiobook. I read most of my nonfiction in audio format because then it's more like a podcast and I absorb it a lot better, whereas if I'm just reading it plain, I get distracted and I feel like it's work. So I read this one, again, through audio, so mostly I listen to it on my breaks at work and while playing video games, but it was captivating. I picked it up because I wanted another book on just the weird myths and legends of America after the first one disappointed me in its range, and this one was specifically about haunted places. I went in thinking it was going to be like, this haunted house in Kansas, here is its story, here is why people think it's haunted. I will now go to it and do it. I thought it was going to be kind of a BuzzFeed Unsolved thing. It wasn't. Instead, it was a fascinating book breaking up into discussing haunted houses to haunted state-owned locations, haunted businesses, and then ending with a section on haunted towns and exploring not whether or not ghosts are real and whether these places are actually haunted, but why we as a culture look at places like this and assume they could be haunted and why we project ghost stories onto these locations. And it was especially interesting to me when it was discussing state-owned haunted locations such as old prisons and old state asylums, because where I went to college actually is discussed in the book, and there were a lot of legends that it discussed that I remember being major stories that actually affected different activities I did at school. I had to do a whole project on this asylum he was talking about. And so it was just very fascinating to hear it, not in a college student, ooh, ghost stories way, or hear it in a, my school now owns the place, so they are trying to like clean up the history and not make it sound nearly as bad as it was in order to keep it polished and not fall into this incredibly tragic story. But it was so he discussed it fully for what it is, but in a much more historical and not, frankly, jackassy, insensitive college student haunting way. And so that was very interesting for me as well. The audiobook is also phenomenal. The take on whether or not, just completely ignoring whether ghosts are real or not, and just simply saying, why is it these places are what draw this attention, whether it's drawing the attention of ghosts or drawing the attention of people thinking there are ghosts. Why is it like that? I was hooked. I read it in about I want to say 3 days. I highly recommend it. 4 out of 5 stars. However, was not the best nonfiction that I read for the month. That book would be Radium Girls by Kate Moore. I loved this book. Bawled my eyes out reading it. Again, it was an audiobook that I read. I do most of my nonfiction audio. I explain this. Radium Girls follows girls from a radium plant in Orange, New Jersey, and one from just outside of Chicago. And they were dial painters, meaning back in like the 1920s, 1930s, early on when radium was first discovered, before it was known publicly as just horribly harmful, these women painted the numbers and painted the hands on watches so that they would glow in the dark and you could see them. It became incredibly important during both world wars because soldiers needed to be able to read the dials on their watches, read the dials on their planes, and so they worked day in and day out, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of girls painting these dial faces. But to do that, radium was so expensive, they didn't want to waste any, and they had like, their brushes were camel hair. There was only like 16 hairs per brush or something absurd like that, and they still weren't fine enough, and they were taught the best way to keep these brushes fine enough is to dip it in the radium, put it in their mouth, pull it between their teeth, and swirl it between their lips, and that would make it a fine enough point that they could get the fine details they needed. The issue with that is they were consuming radium day in and day out for years. And with radium's slow half-life, it took years for them to realize that they were going to have health issues from this. And so it's the story of these women dying slow and painful deaths and suing the companies, and the companies doing everything they can to cover it up and insist these women had no radium poisoning, no harm at work. There were a few things that were brushed over. For example, the man who won the case for the girls in Orange had to sign a contract for a later case saying he would never be involved in a case about radium poisoning ever again. And it was just kind of mentioned in brief and then never discussed. And so there were things like that that I wish it didn't brush over, but overall, 5 out of 5. I highly recommend it. If this ends up being the second year where the third book I read becomes one of my top 5 books of the year, I would not be shocked. Then we get into the fiction I read for this month. I read 2 digital books and I read 1 physical book. And I am proud to say, I am beyond proud to say, the physical book I read is finally Sky Beyond the Storm by Sabaa Tahir. I'm not going to spend long on it because it is the 4th book in a series, and I also feel like I have never shut up about it. This is one of my favorite series. It is a multi-perspective fantasy series inspired by Middle Eastern folklore and the Roman Empire, and it is fantastic. It is full of angst-ridden romance if you want that. It is full of incredibly dynamic political intrigue. This series has one of the only, if not the only, redemption arc I find comparable to Zuko's. The characters in this are so fleshed out. I can't hate a single one. They're so dynamic. They're all so well written that you love them as a character, but you hate them as a person is highly possible. I cannot sing praise enough for this series. Just know that I stayed up till 2 a.m. on a night that I had work finishing this book. I bawled my eyes out. I highly recommend it. It was fantastic. I am so glad I finally read it. So yes, this is another one that would not be shocked if it ends up on my books of the year, simply because this series definitely makes my top 5 series of all time list. Fantastic wrap up to the series. I loved where all the characters went. I could not have cried harder. Book 5 that I read was then Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. It took me way too many takes to say her name right, but that's not what we're going to discuss. Keeper of the Lost Cities is a middle grade series following Sophie Foster, a 12-year-old genius who also happens to be a telepath with a photographic memory. And within the first 10 pages of this book, she discovers she is in fact an elf from the hidden cities. All the magic ancient cities we spent years and years and years learning about in school, Atlantis, Shangri-La, those sort of places, they're actually the lost cities which have been hidden by magic by the elves, and it is where they now live, seeing as they believe as humans broke a treaty hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the elves then cut them off from their source of magic and power, and Sophie has been raised among humans and is now forced into the world of elves, realizing she may be more powerful than she even realizes. Weird pitch, right? That's the basic summary of the series. But what you actually need to know is this middle grade series, it is advertised as elves, it is advertised as magic. This series is like Winx Club, because as much as there is fantasy, there is science. It explains that the elves, yes, they all have powers. Like, there are telepaths, there are elementalists, there are people who have magical abilities, but most of the technology they use, such as light leaping, which is basically teleporting, is science-based. But no, it loved it. It was this weird mix of sci-fi and fantasy. It worked very well. If you go on Goodreads, there are some reviews referring to the main character as an overpowered Mary Sue, and I will say, she just keeps unlocking powers. I will say that she is incredibly overpowered, but it's a middle grade book about a 12-year-old. It's expected in the genre very often. This book hits like 14 genres and it's fabulous. I ended up giving it only a 3.5 just because it was very long, and I feel like it didn't really start getting into the plot of the series until about halfway through, which is understandable. It is the first book in a massive series. It had a lot of setup to do. It had to explain the entire world, but the world is fascinating enough. I love Shannon Messenger's writing style, and the characters are a riot. So 3.5, I recommend. I'm really excited for the second book. And finally, I read The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I don't know how to say her name, and I am so sorry. Looks like it says Acevedo. That's probably closer than Acevedo because there's no A, but the point is, I read this book. I hadn't been planning to read this book. It came up on my library holds. I didn't think I was going to read it so quickly because I got it on like January 29th. I finished it January 30th and I loved it. I will say I only gave it 4 stars, which is actually, to me, a phenomenal rating given the fact it is written in verse. It is written in verse, and I don't like poetry. I do not like poetry at all. In fact, even this book, I would catch myself reading it, and the second they would do formatting changes to make an emphasis, my brain would revert back to high school, and I'd be reading it, and instead of thinking, wow, this is an intense scene, I look at a name shifted in a line to the right and I go, that's for emphasis and this is why, and I'd feel like I need to write an essay. I would feel like I needed to write an essay. It wasn't fun when that would happen. It would pull me out of the story, but that is nothing of the fault in the book, so I did not have that affect my rating. However, I will say the story made me very sad and was rough to get through. The story itself follows Ziamara, who is a 15-year-old who turns 16 about halfway through the book. She writes poetry to get all her thoughts down. She has a journal that her brother gave her for like their 10th birthday. Her twin brother gave it to her, and she puts all her thoughts down on it in poetry, and a lot of those thoughts have to do with the fact that she and her mother just never see eye to eye. Her mother worships the ground that her brother walks on, but seems to resent her and wants her to be the nun that she never could be, because her mother is an incredibly devout Catholic who married her father so that they could move to the States. She was an opportunity for their family to move from the Dominican Republic to the States. And so Ziamara is, of course, a girl growing up. She is attractive, she doesn't want to be, but she wants to be able to be a free girl, but her mom is forcing her to go to communion classes, making her be this perfect Catholic girl that she just isn't, and taking it to the extremes, such as if you talk to a boy, you are committing this sin of lust in it. And so there's a lot of strain between her and her mother, and it is Ziamara trying to find a way to put that strain into words while still trying to understand her mother and hopefully break free of where they are in life. That being said, for me to read a book with poetry and thoroughly enjoy myself and not feel like I'm having to analyze every page, there was only a handful of poems that I was like, shoot, I'm supposed to be analyzing this. I'm sure if you went to an American high school system, you know what I mean. Poetry's ruined for us, and for me to be able to sit through this book in verse and enjoy myself was phenomenal. And the story was also phenomenal. I'm going to say the word phenomenal enough that it's not a word anymore. Either way, 4 out of 4 stars. I highly recommend. That is my entire January wrap up. I am on Tumblr and Instagram at Babbling Books. Instagram is spelled differently, spelled with a Z, because I couldn't get my own handle. I also have my Goodreads link down below. So follow me on my other social medias. I hope to have another video out soon. If not, it's because my life is currently extremely chaotic. We will see how it goes. Thank you so much for watching. I don't have an outro. I don't want to figure out an outro today. Goodbye.